What does God think about divorce? What does God say about separation? I wrestled with these questions before getting married and continue to seek Him on them now that I'm married. But when I read the Old Testament book of Ruth, I see an answer. In this video, we'll discover why it's so important to seek God's will before making big life decisions by exploring 3 lessons from Ruth chapters 1, 2, and 3. First, let's get some basic information out of the way. What is the setting of the book of Ruth? The book of Ruth takes place during the time period known as the Judges era, which is a lawless time when everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Judges 21-25. Main characters include Naomi, who is our main character and protagonist, Elimelech, who is Naomi's husband, Mahlon and Chilion, who are Naomi's 2 sons, Ruth, who is Mahlon's wife, and Orpah, who is Chilion's wife. The setting begins in Bethlehem, which means house of bread, and shifts to Moab, which is a neighboring country known for its paganism and idol worship. Now let's jump into our first mistake, moving without God's guidance. After living in Bethlehem, Elimelech, Naomi's husband, decides to move to Moab because of a famine that was ravaging the land. Notice that there's no indication throughout the entire story of him seeking God's face or asking for wisdom before making this huge decision. He simply acts based on his own understanding. Remember, this is during the time of the Judges, a time characterized by lawlessness and people doing what was right in their own eyes. So instead of turning to God, Elimelech turns to himself and makes a decision that ultimately has massive consequences. It's also important to note that this famine most likely wasn't just a physical problem, but also a spiritual one. You see, God sometimes allowed physical hardships like famines, droughts, and plagues as a result of sin. For example, in chapter 10 of 1 Chronicles, God sent a famine to Israel for 3 years because of King David's census. So it's possible that the famine in the book of Ruth was a consequence of Israel's sin during that time period. During their stay in Moab, Elimelech's sons end up marrying Moabite women, Orpah and Ruth, who were the daughters of Moab's king and queen respectively. Now, this isn't sinful in itself, since Ruth is later called a woman of valor, Proverbs 31, but it was a high-risk situation because Moab was a pagan land filled with idol worship, false gods, and the occult. So we see this couple willingly stepping themselves into a compromising situation where they would be surrounded by influences that would distract them from God. So we come to a very important point. Acting on your own understanding instead of seeking God's will can have serious consequences. Now keep in mind, God still works in history and people's lives despite their disobedience. And we see that play out in the rest of the book of Ruth, but it's clear that God disciplines his children. And in this case, he disciplines Elimelech and his sons. You see, shortly after, Elimelech dies, along with both of his sons, leaving Naomi a bitter widow with 2 daughter-in-laws, Orpah and Ruth. We could look at this as God's discipline over the family for disobeying his voice and seeking their own comfort, protection, and security in Moab, instead of seeking his face. In other words, God allowed them to reap the consequences of their actions. After hearing that God had brought food back to the land of Israel, Naomi decides to leave Moab and return to Bethlehem. There's an interesting symbolism here. Remember that the name Bethlehem means house of bread? So when Naomi is finally able to return, it symbolizes her going back to the spiritual source, the place where God had been providing all along. This emphasizes the idea that God is the ultimate provider and that he wants his people to seek him first before looking elsewhere. Now, before we move on, please take a moment to like and subscribe if you haven't already. Your support helps us reach more people with the gospel of Jesus Christ. Second, let's talk about how to discern God's will. One of the biggest questions people have is, how do you know what God's will is? Do you pray about it? Do you fast? Do you dream about it? So in light of the book of Ruth, I want to share with you a biblical formula for discerning God's will. I call this formula the hand of knowing God's will, and it consists of 4 parts. First, look for any direct instructions in the Bible. For example, in Matthew 28-19, Jesus instructs his disciples to make disciples of all nations, which is one way we know God's will. Second, pray. Submit your desire to God. James 5:16 says the prayer of a righteous person has great power as it is working. As you pray, listen for any impressions or confirmations. Third, get godly counsel. 1 Thessalonians 5:21 says to test all things, hold fast what is good. Abstain from every form of evil. Talk to at least 3 people you consider spiritual mentors. Fourth, look for circumstances. Are there any obvious closed or open doors? God often speaks through circumstances. You might receive a job offer in the exact amount you prayed for. Or maybe a friend calls you out of the blue to invite you to a Bible study you've been needing. Once you've done all these steps, then you have the green light to act. This formula gives you the confidence you need to obey God and follow his voice. In other words, if you want to know God's will, look at Scripture, pray, get counsel, and look at your circumstances. And remember, if your decision doesn't require any action, then it doesn't need a big answer. Third, let's talk about commitment. In the book of Ruth, both Orpah and Ruth are faced with a decision that will determine where their future lies. They could return to their homeland of Moab or stay with Naomi and go back to Bethlehem. Orpah ends up choosing to return to her family and friends in Moab, while Ruth chooses to stay with Naomi. There's an interesting contrast between the two sisters-in-law. Orpah represents partial love and commitment, while Ruth represents full devotion. Orpah asks, "Where you go, I will go," but she stops short of fully committing to Naomi's plan. Ruth, on the other hand, doesn't just say she will go with Naomi, she goes further. She declares, "Your God will be my God, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Their God will be our God." And she remains steadfast in her commitment to Naomi, refusing to be swayed by external circumstances or pressures. Now, why is this important for us today? Well, Ruth's decision to stay with Naomi despite the potential challenges demonstrates the kind of commitment we should have in our relationships and in our faith. In marriage, for example, Ruth's vow to stick by Naomi's side, no matter what, serves as a great reminder to remain committed through thick and thin. Similarly, in our walk with Christ, we must be willing to stand firm in our beliefs and not be shaken by the changing opinions or challenges we face. In conclusion, the book of Ruth teaches us a lot. First, don't act based on what seems right in your eyes, but seek God's will first. Last and always, even if you wander like Naomi and her sons did, God welcomes you back with open arms. Second, we learned a biblical formula for discerning God's will, so be sure to review that. And third, live a life of commitment, whether in your marriage, family, or faith. Let Ruth's example inspire you to stay true to your commitments no matter the cost. I hope this video blessed you. If so, hit the like button and subscribe. If you haven't already, until next time, may God bless you and help you seek His will in all you do.